Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our seminar this week. Interestingly, we very, very rarely have seminars on printed material as such, and we even more rarely have seminars on the pre-Republican period of any kind of written production. Certainly, I can remember none. So we are both apologetic and delighted to welcome our speaker from the British Library today to help us fill this this gap in our knowledge. And of course, it's a very hot day, so there are not very many people with us. But with the permission of the speaker, we'll put the talk on the website, and that means that many generations of future members of our society will be able to learn more about the importance of the British Library. And so we have to welcome Dr. Erdman, who tells me he trained at SOAS, just down the road. And the floor is yours. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the thank you to everyone for attending, and especially thank you to the Anglo-Turkish Society, and particularly Craig for organizing this and for providing me with a platform to talk about a topic that is very dear to me, the Ottoman Turkish manuscripts at the British Library. And so I'm just going to see if I can bring up the mouse is a bit finicky. There we go. So I can get the mouse working and be able to share the screen. There we go. Okay. Share screen 2. Okay, just minimize that. So, welcome to everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the Ottoman Turkish manuscripts at the British Library. And my name is Dr. Michael Erdman, as David was so kind to introduce me. And I've been at the library for about 10 years now. I started as the Turkish and Turkic curator. Actually, I started as the Ottoman cataloger on a 6-month project at the library before I came on as the Turkish and Turkic curator. And then about 3.5 years ago, became the head of the Middle East and Central Asia section. And this is sort of my swan song, as next week I'll start as that head of as the interim head of Asia and Africa. So I get to have a broader overview, much like the Ottomans, of a variety of different continental qualities. What I'm going to do today is give you a bit of an overview of not only what we hold, but also why we hold it and how it came into the library. So what I will look to do then is start off by giving you an overview of the British Library and its history and why we are where we are, before going on to the Middle East and Central Asia section and looking specifically at the Turkic collections within it. And I'll look at the documentation that we produce around those collections, and then the provenance of them. So both how we describe the manuscripts and provide you with what we call discoverability, and then also how they came into our holdings. Before going on to sort of librarian's term of development, meaning what is it that we hold, how does it break down in terms of subject, themes, types of works. Before going to the notable work, so that's where most of the pretty pictures are going to be, to give you a sense of some of the most notable manuscripts that we have collected over the last 270 years. And then look very briefly at some of the future perspectives and work that we hope to do, what still needs to be done to understand the collection and the pieces that make the constituent parts. And I apologize, I failed to ask what the size of the screen would be. So there'll be some text that's a bit mashed, and that's because I didn't space it out as it should have been, but hopefully it's still readable as we go through the slides. So the British Library, and since we're here in Fitzrovia, I'm sure it's familiar to all of you, the building just down Euston Road. This is our flagship building here in St. Pancras. We do also have a space in Boston Spa in Yorkshire, and a rapidly developing one in Leeds as well. So we are gradually trying to branch out across the country. The library was founded in 1753. So at that point, Sir Hans Sloane, along with a number of other well-known erudite aristocrats who had collected manuscripts or had acquired libraries over the 17th and 18th, early 18th century, banded together to be able to create a storehouse of knowledge. So they collected manuscripts, but they also collected printed works and other objets d'art, archaeological materials, and they felt the need to have a centralized body, a museum in London, to encourage the development of science and learning and knowledge, a very Enlightenment type project in the center of London. And the government of the day, the crown of the day, decided that that was a very worthwhile project. King George III came on board, donated along with their collections. He donated a portion of his library as well. And in 1753, the British Museum came into being, and we were the library of the British Museum. We started off with about 4,000 manuscripts at that point, and the museum continued to acquire materials, often from other aristocratic collections, from well-known families and scholars throughout England, Scotland, and Wales, but then increasingly through commercial means as well. The number of non-European, non-Western European materials grew considerably. So in 1867, an Oriental manuscript section was created. In 1891, an Oriental manuscripts and printed books department was founded. And finally, in the post-World War II period, the government of the day, responding to criticism in the press, decided that it needed something more than just the library of the museum. It needed a library for the nation, a library that would support academic pursuits, that would support the care and curation of written works and cultural heritage. And so in 1972, it passed the British Library Act, which came into force in 1973, creating legally the British Library, so on paper, in 1973, an agglomeration of 11 different libraries. So some were other libraries collecting libraries of science material, and Colindale was the collection of the nation's newspaper heritage, and you have a number of other types of libraries that were banded together in 1973 and eventually moved throughout the 1990s into this large building, which was not the favorite of our current king, but he came to enjoy it, and is now the location of those national collections. And the one additional part of our history, of our institutional history, that's quite important to know, is that so the India Office Library, which was the library of the East India Company, founded, it has its origins in 1798, but formally founded in 1801, which was the library connected with British colonial endeavors in South Asia, and nationalized, taken into the crown in 1858, and continues to be the property of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. But in 1982, the decision was to move all of its holdings into the British Library. And so we today care for all of those manuscripts, printed material, archival material, furniture, paintings, but they are technically owned by the FCDO. So that gives you a sense of the institutional history, which will become important as we look at the provenance of the Ottoman manuscripts. The British Library has over 170 million items, and this is largely in part thanks to the fact that we are the legal deposit for the nation. So since the 19th century, most of legal deposit exists since the late 17th century, but definitely through the 19th century, everything was moved into the British Museum. We are the only mandatory legal deposit for the country. So if you publish anything in the United Kingdom, you must place a copy electronically or physically with us. There are 5 other legal deposit libraries that have the right to request it. But that means that our collections grow very rapidly every year. And we are also the store of national treasures. So works that might be familiar to you, NMS 43725, which is perhaps better known as Codex Sinaiticus, a 4th or 5th century complete copy of the New Testament, the earliest copy, Cotton MS Nero D4, which is the Lindisfarne Gospels, is a late 7th or early 8th century bejeweled, beautiful gospel. And then, of course, at the top right hand here, Cotton MS Vitellius A15, which is a either 11th or 12th century copy of Beowulf. So we hold incredible works related to the history of cultural production in the United Kingdom and around the world. And indeed, the fact that we hold such large collections of material from around the world means that the library is divided into different regions. Um, I don't know how to put this, sort of like geolinguistically, let's say. So on one side of the building, you have Western heritage, which accounts for what is classically understood as being Western, meaning Western Europe and Greek, Greek and Latin. Whereas everything else that comes from east of the meridian of the of Greenwich is part of Asian and African collections. So within Asian and African collections, we have different sections that are the languages of different regions. My section is the languages of the Middle East and Central Asia. You see a number of different examples of what we hold, whether it's Sultan Babur's Quran from 1305-06, copied by Ibn al-Wahid, a beautiful Mamluk Quran, or the Golden Haggadah, a mid-13th century Passover service book from Catalonia, a Menelongian, a mid-17th century Armenian Lives of Saints from Istanbul, or an Armeno-Turkish work, İpek Böceği, Tarifnamesi. We have another one that's very close to name, an Armeno-Turkish work on the rearing of silkworms. So we cover the languages traditionally associated with the Middle East and Central Asia. Whereas my colleagues in the South Asian section will cover the languages of South Asia. So even Urdu newspapers printed in Bradford and Hindi books produced in Sao Paulo, because those languages aren't seen as being from South Asia, they are cared for by the South Asia section. So that's the distinction in how we work compared to a museum, where the museum might deal with all of the different artifacts from a specific region or culture. We take care of 32,000 manuscripts. It's always very challenging to count exactly how many manuscripts you have, because fragments, are they a single manuscript? Are they parts of a manuscript? And then we have about 350,000 printed items. And that's not that much compared to the English language material, but it is a very large collection compared to other holdings of printed material in the languages of the Middle East and Central Asia in this country, to over 100,000 Arabic printed books and over 75,000 printed Hebrew books, and then several tens of thousands of Persian and Turkic material books, Turkic language books, rather. So our section consists of Arabic, and here you have the Mile Quran, an 8th century fragmentary Mus'haf, one of the earliest copies of the Quran, or pieces of a copy of a Quran in the world. We have what we call Eastern Christianity, so Armenian, Coptic, Syriac, and this is a gospel from 1216 to 1220 from Mosul, beautifully illustrated in Syriac. We, of course, have Turkish and Turkic, which we'll see, and this is from 1716, a Vakfiye, probably from Thessaloniki. Persian, a copy, as you would expect, of the Shahnameh, this being the 16th century copy from Iran, and then Hebrew and Jewish languages. Here you have the Duke of Sussex's German Pentateuch, a 14th century copy of the 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, or the Torah, produced in Germany. And so as you can see, we're divided by these languages, but there is a real tension between culture and language always. Because, of course, when we talk about Ottoman works, we could be talking about Ottoman Armenian works. We could be talking about Ottoman Hebrew works. And one of the challenges we constantly face is being able to break beyond those administrative lines between the languages to reflect the cultures and the countries from which the materials are sourced. When it comes to Turkish and Turkic collections, what we have is about 2,000 manuscripts. So about 1,850 manuscripts are in Oghuz languages. And we usually call these simply the Ottoman Turkish manuscripts, but of course there are 10 Azerbaijani ones, 1 Turkmen manuscript, and then a number of manuscripts that are in Western Turkic languages that are not associated typically with Istanbul's courtly culture. So a language that's in, for example, a dialect of Turkish from the Balkans is still considered Ottoman Turkish. The remaining 150 items, roughly 150 items, are Eastern Turkish, primarily Chagatai, but also Uyghur, and other associated dialects from the various language families represented across Central Asia and Siberia. And we have about 30,000 printed items going from actually the 16th century. So there was, in fact, 16th or early 17th century. There was, in fact, printing in Turkish in Germany before there was printing in the Ottoman Empire in Turkish. And we really only cover the Turkic languages post 1400. So the collection that we're looking at, we have a couple of manuscripts from the 1390s. You'll see one of them very shortly. But what we're looking at effectively is the creation of culture under the Ottomans and contemporaries in Central Asia. We do hold as a library materials that are in runic Turkic, in Old Uyghur, so materials that were produced in non-Muslim societies prior to the introduction of Arabic as the primary script of reporting for Muslim majority Turcophone communities. But those are part of the Stein collection. So we try to keep the collection amassed by Earl Stein and a few other explorers in Western China together because they reflect a single library. And so I do work with my colleagues who work on the Stein collection to care for example, the Urkbitik, which is probably the earliest known divinatory book in runic Turkic, but it's not considered part of the Turkic collection. And finally, we have minority languages, Caucasian languages, and Kurdish as part of this collection. So because there is obviously an affinity in terms of the space within which they were produced, and if we're talking about printed materials, market forces mean that most Kurdish materials today are probably divided between Iraq and Turkey, but more easily accessible from Turkey. And so when we buy books, it's easier to simply buy the Turkish books as part of the Kurdish books as part of the Turkish ones. But you have a selection here of different types of materials that we have. So the top right-hand corner is a 16th or 17th century Falname, a work of divination, often related to Jafar al-Sadiq. And in the top left-hand corner, the Judisname, a letter from II Sultan Süleyman to James II in 1687, expressing the desire for friendly relations between the Ottoman Empire and at that point the Kingdom of England. The bottom right-hand corner, Dua Kitabu, a prayer book, which was produced in 1891 by Sayyid Hafiz Hussein, who is a Crimean refugee. So we have a few pieces that, like this, if you're familiar, you'll probably get a sense by the end of what a typical Ottoman color palette looks like. But here this is slightly different. The bright yellows, bright green, bright red tend to be associated a bit more with the Caucasus, and Crimea lends itself a bit more to the Caucasus in terms of manuscript culture. So the evidence of the wave movement of peoples also influences change in the production of culture in the Ottoman capital. And finally, at the bottom left-hand side, we have Khawas al-Aliya, which is a prayer book created for Uchinju Mustafa. So it's created in the 18th century, and it is mainly prayers in Arabic with some explanatory texts in Turkish, but beautifully illuminated. So when we talk about illumination, traditionally it's tezhip in Turkish, and painting with gold or gilding of the manuscripts, but illumination can now expand out to include silver, other metals, and sometimes also just colored pigments. So you get a sense, hopefully now, of that we have a breadth of materials. And the question might arise, if we have 2,000 manuscripts, or even just 1,850 in Ottoman Turkish, how do you go about finding these materials? How do we start to provide information about trying to access them and read them and study them? We don't keep our manuscripts, we don't keep our heritage items out on open shelves because we are very conscious of the impact that the environment and usage have on their stability. So we have special stores for keeping the manuscripts that are low oxygen, low light, and specialty fire prevention. And as a result, you have to order up a manuscript to the reading room so that this way we can, all cultural heritage is degrading. It's a fact of physics. It will fall apart. But we try to reduce that half-life, or increase the half-life rather, reduce the speed at which it decays, by having it in a controlled environment. And so when you're trying to then find materials, there are a few different ways in which you can do this, and primarily through the process of cataloging, what we would call in the library world discovery. And so the first catalog is the Rhea catalog, produced in 1888. Charles Rhea was the first keeper of Oriental manuscripts, and so he's the one who took over in 1867, and he was an Islamic studies specialist, or a specialist in the languages of West Asia. He wrote the supplement to the Arabic catalog, he wrote the Persian catalog, and then wrote the Ottoman catalog as well. So he was a polymath in some sense. And essentially, he created metadata, which is data about data and information about the manuscripts. And the RIA catalog is very interesting as a snapshot into the way that the cultural heritage was formed and understood, because he was using categories that, of course, reflected science and social sciences at the time that the catalog was created. But he was also operating in a space where Turkey and the Ottoman Empire were synonymous, and where Turkish and Ottoman were synonymous. So there was no Istanbul Türkçesi, there was no Republican Turkish as a standard to use as a way to record in Latin script the names of the titles of the authors. And so it's an interesting snapshot of a language that doesn't exist, that isn't used anymore, along with a way of understanding that language that is no longer necessary because we have contemporary Turkish to use to access the cultural heritage of the Turkic-speaking peoples. But this mentioned catalog accounts for probably about a quarter of all of our holdings, because after it was published, there was a great increase in the amount of material that was acquired by the library by purchase or by donation. And so we needed to find other ways of accounting for what we held. Unfortunately, no one decided to write a catalog in the same way that RIA had. And instead, we have what are called acquisition slips. Colloquially, we call them blue slips. Essentially, they are materials that we have, and they're blue because I realize that color palette is not what you find in reality. So these are actually blue. And they are essentially records for when something was purchased. And so when you purchase something, you have to have a record as to what it is, usually physical description and a bit about content, so that we can account for how the money was spent over time, when things came in, who they came in from. But it creates a bit of a catalog that's not 100% useful for the scholar who wants to know what are all of your divans, but it at least gives a sense of what we have. And the last time we had a printed work that was produced was in 1981. Nord Titley, who worked at the British Museum and then Library and was an art historian who specialized in the art history of West Asia. And so we have this incredible catalog that is the miniatures from Turkish manuscripts, which goes up to about the OR 13,000s in terms of essentially up to the acquisitions into the late 1970s, cataloging only the illustrations, because the manuscripts are often prized more either for their decoration or their illustrations rather than their content. And so she created what is our only means of really going through and systematically understanding what sort of heritage we hold in terms of representation of people, plants, places within the manuscripts. In 2013, we created an online catalog, which we used for about 10 years, until we had a cyber attack in October of 2023. The catalog came offline, but we luckily still have the data. And this catalog was republished in December of last year. And this is the catalog that allows for the easiest means to really enter the data about what we hold and find what you're looking for. So to find titles or authors or subjects. This is searcharchives.bl.uk. But essentially, it's a way in which we can try to increase the types of information that we provide to researchers, and the way in which they can access things and know what they want to use when they come to the library, and the way in which, as well, we can reflect the history of the collection in a much more manageable way. So the data can then be used to create visualizations, for example, of where things come from, who they came into the library from, and when they were acquired. And this is perhaps a bit technical, but it's a way of understanding as well that there are always two sides to a manuscript collection. So we're going to go in later after this to get a better sense of the works themselves. But the flip side of this is a manuscript collection aims to reflect something about the culture from which the manuscripts were taken. But it's necessarily selective. It's necessarily, it is exhaustive. It's really just a snapshot. And so trying to arrange the information about the collection as an object as well is very important for us as a library, because that's as much a point of interest for someone who wants to understand why we conceive of Turkish cultural heritage in a certain way, why we conceive of Ottoman cultural heritage vis-a-vis Turkish cultural heritage differently, And why is it that, for example, there might have been literary studies of Ottoman works in the UK, but no studies of Ottoman religiosity, no studies of Ottoman governance? And is it because the collections that were amassed did not see those as important topics for collection, or is it perhaps because they were poorly cataloged and remained undiscoverable? So it gives us a bit of a historiography of Ottoman cultural production in addition to a history of Ottoman cultural production. And one of the pieces of information we try to include in the catalog is the provenance of the works. And by provenance, of course, provenance is a very broad topic. And so you can look at the provenance journey from when a manuscript is created right up to where it is today. Often that's very challenging to do because you sometimes have that information written. So in Islamic societies, it was very common that you would write, I bought this from so-and-so, I sold it to so-and-so on this date in this place. But not all of the manuscripts have that. And so the only reliable source of information that we can look to is our own records. And that means we look at the provenance of the manuscripts as the last stage where they were before we took them into our collections. And that gives us a bit of a sense in terms of who is selling, who amassed materials, how they came into the country. The first point of call is always our foundational, what we call our foundational collection. So these are the manuscripts and printed materials that came in 1753. Legally, they were acquisitioned in 1757, and as part of those original collectors who banded together to form the museum. So the Harley collection, the Sloane collection, the Stowe and Grenville collections. And here there's actually a very small number of manuscripts that are in Turkic languages. So in total, we have about 4,000 manuscripts that came in 1757 into the balance sheet, if you will, of the museum. And of those, only 75 are in Turkic languages, both Eastern Turkish and Ottoman. And the largest number are the Harley manuscripts. So there's 34 Harley manuscripts that are in Turkic, followed by Sloane with 28, and then 1 or 2 each in the other smaller collections, including only 3 from the Royal Collection. This is Harley MS 5511. So it's the Garibname of Aşık Paşazade, which is a very, if you're familiar with sort of Ottoman statecraft, it's a very well-known work. Aşık Paşazade is a historian, but also he creates, in some sense, a historical and legitimizing narrative for the Ottoman house. And so it should be no surprise that actually Harley, who is amassing materials that really reflect the empire, seeks to choose a work that is by a scholar who is the one who writes part of that narrative of why the Ottomans need to retain their power. And a number of Harley's works come through a man known as Solomon Negri. So there's another aspect here that's quite interesting, which is Negri was an Arab Christian who often went between West Asia and Western Europe and would act as both a conduit for manuscripts to be sold to those who were interested in the cultures of North Africa and West Asia, but would sometimes translate as well. So would also act as a producer of knowledge in Western Europe. And so it's an interesting connection there between Harley and Negri. We don't have many more materials that come in the intervening 50 years or so until 1825, when the museum buys about 400 manuscripts from the widow of a man named Sir Claudius Rich. Rich was the representative of the crown in Baghdad. He went out in 1812, and he was fascinated by the cultures and the history of the peoples of West Asia. So he bought a huge number of manuscripts in Arabic, Syriac, Turkish, Eastern Turkic, even a few examples in Kurdish, Persian, and of these roughly 400 items, about 124 were in Turkic languages, primarily Turkish. And this is Adamas 7894. It's a text called Ajab al-Makhlukat, which is a text originally written by Ghazvini in Persian, and then translated into Arabic at some point, and then Sururi translates in the 15th century, or 16th century, excuse me, from Arabic into Turkish. And it's basically a cosmography. It's a look at the world, all of the wonders in the world, all of the different types of people and plants and animals, many of them fantastical, some of them real. But it's a standard text that you see in almost every Islamic society as being a prize text that someone, the ruler needs to know about the world. And here we have an interesting illustrated copy, perhaps not the best illustrations, but still a mid 16th century copy that sort of shows the way in which these texts are taken into the Ottoman realm and then translated into Ottoman. So there's also a record here through Rich of different aspects of Ottoman statecraft and governance. And other aspects of Rich's collection that we take in are things like lists of the number of schools or madrasas or mosques in Baghdad and population counts in parts of Iraq. Histories of different pilgrimage sites in Iraq or in Syria. So there's a lot of a very eclectic mix of materials that help to tell us a bit more about the daily as well as the lofty lives of Ottoman subjects and rulers. Throughout the remainder of the 19th century, we get a number of different individuals who, again, are posted either to West Asia or now to India, who acquire materials. You know, it might be 8 or 10 that we purchase from them. And men like Turner and Murray go to Turner and goes to Cairo, Murray goes to Tehran, and Taylor goes to Baghdad after Rich passes away in Baghdad. Hamilton and Erskine go to India, and they buy sort of representative works that sort of show how high culture is formed in the Ottoman realm. And we have here one from Murray, which is Sir Charles A. Murray, who was posted in the mid-19th century to Tehran. And this is a work, the Divan of Nabai, which is probably 16th century, produced in Iran with beautiful lacquer bindings. And so actually the binding is a British Museum one, but the boards, rather, so the front and back of the work, are works of art in themselves, in addition to the manuscript that is between them. And Murray is interesting because he claims that this is a work that was stolen from the treasury of the Shah at the time. It's hard to tell whether that is true or not. The man who sold it to him sold it under those pretenses. And it's important to note that that sometimes those stories are true. Sometimes men like Murray would be wowed by a story about a theft, a daring theft from the Shah's personal library, and so he paid double the price that he would have normally paid. So it's often really challenging, and you have to go through some of the seals to understand, is this in fact from the imperial treasury or not? But they all tend to reflect a bit this fascination with ruling classes and the governance of the empire or of other empires. So from India in particular, Erskine is important because he brings to the UK Waqiyati Baburi, which is the Chagatai copy of the sort of autobiography of Babur and the founding and rise of the Mughal Empire in India, a text that has often been seen in Persian elsewhere, but is a lot rarer in a Turkic language. The last men whose collection, and they were almost always men who were named, although in the case of Richard's a woman, his widow, who is the one who transacts the sale to the museum and is involved in organizing the collection. But unfortunately, Rio only lists the men who were involved in these transactions. And the last one who he notes as being a scholar and whose works go into the library are Alexandre Jabba. And here you have OR 13034, which is just a rationalized list of all of the materials, all of the manuscripts that Jabba sold to the museum and in the latter part of the 19th century. And Jabba is quite important because we get about 300 works from his collection. Sorry, not Jabba, rather, we get 106 works from his collection, and 49 of them are in Turkish. Jabba is important because he's, again, a diplomat, like Murray, like Taylor, like Turner, but he's a Polish-born diplomat for the Russian Empire. He's posted to Cairo, then Izmir, and finally Erzurum. Erzurum is famous, obviously, for the disputes between the Ottomans and the Russians, and the old vilayets go back and forth between the two powers. But Jabba is a chronologist, and he is a scholar of Eastern Anatolia. So his manuscript collections start to reflect not only historiographic trends with the Ottomans, but they also showcase how Ottoman as a language is used by other smaller polities, smaller groups, smaller entities to set their own legitimizing narratives. So the Iskandername, for example, which Sherifi Bitlissi writes to legitimize his own power, outside of the Ottoman realm is also in our collection thanks to Jean's collection. And it's really, again, begins to show how through the 19th century, we move away in the collection from eclectic and piecemeal collecting of aristocrats or diplomats who go out and find curiosities towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, where it's now large libraries that move in and the collection begins to reflect more the establishment of Ottoman studies in different countries throughout Europe, different countries with imperial interests who find a need to create a system of studying the Ottomans and understanding their statecraft. And one particular scholar who fits a bit within this realm, but is not necessarily a diplomat. He, in fact, is not a diplomat, but he is, in some sense, a diplomat in that he introduces Ottoman literary production, is E.J.W. Gibb. Here, you don't have a manuscript, but you have the book plate that you'll find in over 300 manuscripts in our collection, which came to us from Gibb's holdings. E.J.W. Gibb was a Scottish Ottomanist who wrote the Bible on Ottoman literary production and Ottoman literary history in English in the latter part of the 19th century. To do this, he amassed a huge number of manuscripts attesting to the longue durée of Ottoman cultural production. And upon his passing, his estate decided in 1901 to donate the vast majority of these to the British Museum. So at this point, we probably have maybe 500 to 600 works in Ottoman Turkish, and Gibb's 300 sway the collection massively towards the literary genre. Gibb wanted to collect everything related to literature, so we're not just talking about courtly divans, about courtly poetry, but Gibb's collections also include things like regional poets and dialect poets, poets of uncertain origin and existence. So you have these poets who just have Machlashlad, who have sort of pseudonyms that they use or Lachlad or nicknames, and we can't necessarily place them anywhere other than Gibb's collection. So in 1901, what we suddenly have is this massive shift to allow the collection to become a site of intense study and scholarship around the production of literary texts in the Ottoman language and in the Ottoman realm. Gibb also reflects the first massive movement of manuscripts that fall outside of Rieux's catalog. So it's the slight Wild West in the sense that we no longer know exactly what's coming in and how to find it. And it marks the beginning of a long period where you have to be in the know, and you have to probably know one of the curators in order to really help you to find things that don't show up in Rieux's catalog. And it's an important period because the marketplace really changes in the latter part of the 19th century. And the first group of sort of newcomers to this process of selling works are a group of ennobled Armenian merchants who are collectively known as the Amira class now. So they're not necessarily ennobled in the sense that they don't have titles like Duke, or they're not Damatlad or things like that within the Ottoman structure, but they're very well connected, very wealthy men who build these commercial empires, usually around import-export. And they all seem to come from Kayseri in central Turkey. They're all of Armenian origin, and they sell incredibly beautiful works of art. So names like Gulbenkian, Minassian, Kevorkian, Kelekyan, these individuals, these collectors are well known, and the Kevorkian collection in the US is quite famous. Obviously, if you've been to Lisbon, you've probably been to the Gulbenkian and Kalus Gulbenkian Foundation's museum in Lisbon. And they patronized the arts in a way that really changed collections. And they certainly changed the collection at the British Museum, as they were responsible for moving large amounts of cultural heritage, pre-Islamic and Islamic, out from West Asia into the holdings of museums across Western Europe and North America. We still don't know exactly how many works we have from the Amira class of dealers, but works such as this, which is a grammar of Persian in Ottoman Turkish. So it's the Vesiletül Makasid ila İhsan Merasit, which was produced in 1749-50 and was purchased in 1898 from Kelekyan. And as you can see, there's a lot of gold, and there's often a seal that indicates it was from either an imperial or a high-ranking official's library. And there's still a big mystery in terms of how they acquired these materials and how they moved them out. So there's a new element there in terms of the commercial side coming in to really shape the way in which cultural heritage becomes a commodity. The same time that they are selling these works, there's another sort of underbelly of the manuscript market. Other men who are usually not Armenian, but tend to be either Christians or Jews, and it's important that they're non-Muslims because they can often through what are known as the capitulations, so negotiations and negotiated settlements between the Ottoman Empire and European powers, accede to European citizenships. So they might be Christians who become French or Jews who become French citizens, and they might be Orthodox Christians who become Russian citizens. They then can move back and forth between Europe and the Ottoman Empire, and they move with them large amounts of manuscript heritage that are not gold encrusted. So if you think of a regular divan, a regular book of poetry, a history book that maybe was produced for someone who was literate and who kept it in their house library, and then in 10 years, 15 years, decided they would sell it as they moved from Beirut to Istanbul, or from Istanbul to Cairo, or from Cairo to Baghdad. They would mop up these lower ends, sell in bulk, and we have another hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts in all of the languages of West Asia that reflect these dynamics. The two classes knew each other, so the Amira class occasionally accused the non-Amira class of cheating them. The non-Amira class would sometimes accuse museum holders of cheating them. And there would be a very messy situation up until about the 1930s when the purse strings drew tight. And because of the financial crisis, because of the Great Depression, holding institutions could not acquire the same number of manuscripts. And it was unfortunate for the man who came along in the 1930s as the new purveyor of manuscripts, Oscar Ruscher. Here you have 11928, which is Shemsia. It's a sort of like a prognostic or a poem that's kind of like a meteorological, a divinatory poem from 1750-51. Ruscher was a German national who became naturalized as a Turkish citizen in the 20s. And he had spent his military service, part of it in the Ottoman Empire, and he spent the 30s to the 60s as a recluse and as a seller of manuscripts, either as an agent, selling other people's manuscripts or his own, and to European and American institutions. Ruscher was a bit less discerning than the Amira class, but it's still part of many different studies that are ongoing to understand where he got his manuscripts from. Because he wasn't a collector in the way that he would collect only literary works or only historical ones. He was a collector who wanted to sell things. And there was obviously quite a traumatic period through the Second World War where he had quite a large amount of material out in Europe, was not able to return it to Turkey, was not able to retrieve the funds either. And he probably was pushed quite close to the brink of financial ruin, but then had to regain his good stead in Istanbul and worked on his own with his manuscripts, became much more of a recluse, and eventually passed away in the 60s, having left this heritage of hundreds of works across a number of holding institutions, leaving those of us today to understand where they came from and why he was able to sell them. And following Ruscher, we have a number of different open market operations, sort of book dealers. The auction market starts to sell many more Ottoman manuscripts. And for the most part, we don't see huge blocks coming in. So it's one-off purchases every year, every couple of months, that make it very difficult for us to tell what sort of trends there are in terms of cultural heritage and how it moves into the UK. And it's only in the early 2000s that the late Turkologist who was based at SOAS, C.S. Mundy, after he passes away, that his collection of manuscripts becomes available and eventually is purchased by the British Library. And we take about 20 or so of them into our holdings, and it's the last time there's a cohesive collection that comes in. Mundy's work is interesting because Mundy was a Turkologist who was interested in the culture and language of Eastern Anatolia. And so he worked with peoples who were either Kızılbaş, Bektashi, Alevidesh, and people who might have spoken Azerbaijani or dialects related to Azerbaijani in Eastern Turkey and Northwestern Iran. And so we have recordings he made, but we also have the first time collections of Bektashi works that come into the holdings. So sort of as the crowning achievement, the last bit of material that comes in that's not from an auction, that's part of a historic collection, really shifts the focus away from Ottoman as just the language of the divan, of the court and of the ruling elite, towards Ottoman and its dialects as the language of the people who are in many ways alienated and marginalized from the centers of power, and allow us to have a collection that is much richer in understanding Ottoman cultural production from the 15th, 14th, 15th century up to the beginning of the 20th century. I've talked to you for quite some time about where all of these manuscripts came from. As you can see, it's a hot topic for us. We work in libraries, and it's something we really get into quite a lot because it can be quite controversial, but it's also quite an interesting way to make sense of what we work with. And I'm going to touch a bit now on what we call development, which is sort of the themes and topics that you can find within the collection. And one of the first that you'll find are historical works. So you have works such as at the top right, but on the left-hand side, which is our 8071, which are 18th century archival works and administrative documents from the Defter Dad of the Vilayet of Basta in southern Iraq. So as you can see, we sometimes have historical works or administrative works that talk to the history of regions of the empire, or the Kabename, or 6983, which is an 18th century copy of a 16th century work about the reconstruction of the Kaaba, the history of the holiest site in Islam, and the Ottomans' administration of that site. We have works of literature, so OR 7084, which is from 1568-69, perhaps one of the best known Golden Age poets, the Divan of Baki. And this one is lovingly illustrated here, and probably with an image of Baki himself. We have works on religious topics, so a variety of different Sufi texts and reflections of tariqat and both high and low culture, if you will, popular and courtly culture, dominant and marginalized cultures in terms of religious practice, largely about Islam, but also about the non-Muslim peoples. And we have works about language, or 8567, a 19th century word list in Kurdish explained into Turkish. So one of the rare times we get to see a manuscript work that records Kurdish, and not just records Kurdish, it records the importance of knowing Kurdish for engaging with the peoples of Anatolia. And finally, administration, as I noted here, at the top, OR 8071, the Defterdar's works, but also on the right, OR 9506, which is actually a translation of Meurs, usage et coutume de tous les peuples du monde. So it's a French work created in the early 19th century. And I call it sort of an administrative work because the Ottomans wanted to know about the divisions of the world and also other organizations, other polities, understandings of the world as a way to restructure themselves too. So they were often looking at, okay, well, how do others look at the world and understand it? And you get this massive amount of translation as well that comes in, and that also is reflected in a change, especially in the Tanzimat and the Tanzimat period, in the types of materials that we hold. So let's now take a bit of a look. That's sort of the overview of what we hold as intellectual categories, but what are some of the most notable items? Well, first, I want to point to perhaps the oldest Ottoman work we hold, which is Qadi Burhanuddin's Divan. So Qadi Burhanuddin was the ruler of an entity based in Sivas. He's a pre-Ottoman ruler, and he was also a poet and quite a statesman in being able to maneuver around the emergent Ottomans. And this is from 1393 or 94, a collection of his poetry that was copied in Sivas and probably copied in his presence. So it is from the time that the Qadi was alive himself and on the throne. And it's a beautifully illuminated work, and again reflects Ottoman as a language. And so this in Turkish we often call it Eski Anadolu Türkçesi, Old Anatolian Turkish, kind of reflects the emergence of a literary class in Anatolia using Turkic languages, and before Istanbul becomes that real center in 1453. And then we have Harley MS 5500, another Ajaib Mahlukat. I don't know if a newly minted PhD Günste Gürel would cringe that I call it Ajaib Mahlukat. But this is essentially a cosmology, it's a cosmography rather, a look again at the world and all of the wonders of the world. We call it Ajab al-Makhlukat, but it's not necessarily Ghaznavi's work. Sorry, Khwarizmi's work. It's rather a text that's very similar to it, and it contains a number of tales, often either based in India or in Istanbul, illustrated throughout. And it's notable because on the left-hand side here, this image is actually the three horses that signal that this is one of the few Ottoman depictions of the Byzantine hippodrome. And so it's not just a sort of fantastical tales, it's also a bit of a historical work to provide an understanding of how the Ottomans related to the Byzantine heritage within the empire, and then throughout the work, the remains of other ancient cultures throughout Anatolia and Rumelia. This 22,011 is the Nusratname, the Book of Victory. So this was created in 1582, and the man who wrote it was named Gelibolu Ali Mustafa Pasha. So he, actually not Pasha, sorry, and he was with Mustafa Pasha's, Lale Mustafa Pasha. There are two Mustafas here. Gelibolu Ali Mustafa was a literatus. He was a scholar. He was a court figure who was known for trying to enforce proper etiquette. And Lale Mustafa Pasha in 1578 goes out to the Caucasus and conquers Georgia. And this work records that conquest. It records it with incredibly detailed illustrations and imagery. And they're detailed and sought after, in part because sometimes you have the cities shown where someone has actually labeled in Ottoman on the painting what each building is. So you'll actually know that, for example, there were hot baths in Tbilisi in the 1570s, because there are two of them that are listed on the illustration. And you can also use it because the armies are given in great detail. And so scholars continue to come back to look at the manuscript to be able to study not just the text, but also all of the uniforms that each rank would have had, both on the Safavid side and the Ottoman side, and then the Georgian side, in terms of local people's dress as well. And each individual is labeled as to what their function was. So it's both a historical text and also a guide to society. OR 7204 is the Shahnameh. And so the Shahnameh, of course, as you're well aware, hopefully you have heard of the Shahnameh as Ferdowsi's great work about the history of the kings of Iran. And this was translated in the 15th century into a Turkic language for a late Mamluk sultan. And then this copy was actually produced in the late 16th or early 17th century for the Ottomans. And it's, again, beautifully illustrated throughout and heavily illuminated. And what you can occasionally see throughout is an Ottoman who is placed within one of the historic images of Iranian kings prior to 1000. So it's an interesting way to see how the Ottomans like to place themselves across time and space without respect for reality through these illustrated works. OR 13882 is the Hamse of Atayi. So this is from 1738. It's a collection, a cycle of 5 different poetic and prose works by a 17th century a late 16th, early 17th century poet Atayi. And it's an incredible work because there are a number of different illustrated copies, and ours is a later illustrated copy. So the Walters collection holds one from the 17th century. But the work contains stories about Istanbul, and it also contains rival stories. So quite a lot of sex, a lot of violence, a lot of cheating. And there's a number of graphic illustrations of sex acts in here, of heterosexual sex, homosexual sex. And it's an interesting sort of social study about what the understanding of morality was at the Ottoman court, as to where the boundaries lay with sexuality and gender. But it also has this incredible illustration on the right-hand side of the Bosphorus and Istanbul and its gardens on the right and left-hand side on Asia and Europe. OR 7094 is the Zenonname, which is the Book of Women, and it's by a poet whose name is Enderun Mufazil Bey, who lives at the end of the 18th century, dies in 1810. And he is a poet of occasionally called middling ability, but definitely of checkered history. So he was at times celebrated by the Ottoman elite and at times banished to Rhodes. But our copy of this text, which is about the women of the world, so a Shefengiz is a city thriller. It's essentially a collection of different notable wonders of a city. You would have a Shefengiz, for example, of Edirne, and it would list all of the places you should visit in Edirne. Basil Bey writes the Hubaname, the Book of Beautiful Young Men, and then writes the Zönanname, the Book of Women, wherein both he gives the attributes of men and women from around the world, and their advantages and disadvantages, their likelihood to be Ottomanized, and you know the chances that they will be civilized according to the Ottomans. And our copy here of OR 7094, we don't have a date. It is dated actually to 1776, which is impossible because the poem was written in 1794. But it includes 40 illustrations, each of them showing women from different communities. Usually, the further you get from the Ottomans, the more fantastical they become, and especially the indigenous women of the Americas, who sort of look a bit like Shrek for some reason. Probably because the Ottomans did not necessarily meet women. So you get a sense when it comes to the Europeans, what class of person they're meeting based on the illustration, whereas they're not meeting someone from the Americas. So they just have to go about, it's like Juro's rhinoceros. They're going on a textual description. But this text also includes an illustration of the park within the palace on the right-hand side, a brothel scene in the middle, and then a scribe on the left-hand side who is probably imagined to be Enderun Mulfazel Bey, as the book was probably illustrated after his death. OR 9505 is the Halikatul Muluk, is a garden of kings. It's essentially biographies of all of the kings, or all of the sultans rather, that go from Osman Ghazi, so from the first Ottoman all the way up to the middle of the Abdülmecit and into the middle of the 19th century, or early 19th century or so. And what's notable about this one is that if you're familiar with Greek icons, the eyes of the sultans lend that the facial features look much more like the saints, the Madonna, Jesus in a Greek icon. And indeed, it's part of a collection of works that were probably illustrated by a man named Fenerci Mehmet, who is a Greek Orthodox Ottoman who lived and painted in the latter part of the 18th and early part of the 19th century. So it's also slightly a testament to the integration of non-Muslim art and culture into high culture and courtly culture in the Ottoman Empire. Animus 15153 is the Humayunname, which is sort of like the book of the sovereign. But actually, this is the Fables of Bidpai. So it's a collection of works that were translated by Ali Chelebi, and they come from Persia and from India, sort of standard as you would see with a lot of tales and fables that appear in Islamic societies, especially going up to the Middle Ages. But this is incredibly illustrated. It's notable because it's one of the rare Ottoman manuscripts where you have elephants. As you can see on the left-hand side, quite a large number of elephants. But it is also useful for art historians as it shows the beginning of a transition. So one of the frequent criticisms of Ottomans was that they were derivative. Their literature and their art was derivative of what was superior in Iran, or then superior in Europe. And this was a criticism often that was shot at the Ottomans by Western Europeans, occasionally by non-Turkic peoples in the empire. But the Humayunname evidences the development of a vernacular style within the courts that, of course, borrows upon examples from neighboring regions, but the beginning of an emergence of a truly Ottoman language, visual and also literary. And the last work that I want to highlight here as being a sort of notable work to see within the collection is the Kitab-i-Bahriya. So it's the navigation book, or the book of sea navigation. And so perhaps you've heard of P.D. Dace, the 15th, 16th century cartographer. Our copy is a much later copy, so it's 17th century, but this is the Mediterranean a la Ottoman. And so it goes from Istanbul and then goes counterclockwise around the sea and gives the coastline of all of these places, listing all of the different sites along the Mediterranean coast and with the names of the cities, and then short descriptions after each of the maps. And that talk about things like water supplies and the harbor, food supply, and the local population and its relationship to trade. Here you have Crete, for example, on the bottom left-hand side. They are remarkably accurate as maps, and they also show the way in which cartography developed to quite a high level in the Ottoman Empire as an art that underpinned both trade and also military protection of the empire or military expansion. So given all of these different works that we have, this is just a small smattering of the works that are most frequently sought after and often that people will look to borrow. And the online catalog and Rio's catalog account for all of the Ottoman manuscripts that we hold. So there is nothing uncatalogued in the library's collection, and there's nothing undiscoverable in the library's collection. It's maybe not the easiest, but between the PDF of the Rio catalog and the online catalog, you can find everything, at least in terms of title and a bit of content. So what's left to be done then? Well, one thing is complete cataloging. And by this, I mean adding in information about paintings, about illustration, about bindings. So we often focus very much on the content and the data production, but more and more manuscript scholars look to things like how books are produced and how they travel, because that's an important aspect of the book as a social object as well. And we look at digitization. So right now, only 3 Ottoman manuscripts are digitized, and that's 3 out of 1,850. So there's quite a lot to do, but digitization is an important aspect for us because it's preservation. So if something's digitized, it doesn't have to be called up. It's not opened. It's not exposed to higher temperatures and humidity. And it's also accessible from outside of our reading rooms. And the last is research collaboration. So we frequently look to collaborate with researchers in the UK and abroad on a variety of different topics. And one of the big topics that we really want to collaborate on is, I have here both the letters that are part of the Garibname. So the letters I certainly can't read because I'm not a specialist in Enlightenment handwriting or in Latin, from the Harley manuscript, which speak to how this manuscript was not only brought over from West Asia, but was also received upon being sold in England. And then on the left-hand side, OR 7204, that beautifully illustrated copy of the Shahnameh, which has actually here, it's known as a Gibb copy, so it's part of Gibb's library, but actually what you can very clearly see is that it's actually Ferran de Castelo Branco, who is a French-based Portuguese aristocrat. So understanding, given that Gibb did not actually ever visit the Ottoman Empire, but amassed hundreds of volumes, where was he buying them from? How did they actually come into Western Europe? Who enjoyed them and made use of them and then decided to sell them, and why were they sold? Those sorts of understandings of how things came in and how people who didn't go out to the empire came to understand what was important to buy from Ottoman sources and Ottoman cultural production is another stage of really making sense of manuscript collections in this country and around the world. So I've talked to you for a full hour and now, so I'll stop here to say İlginiz için çok minnettarım. Çok teşekkür ederim. I hope it was enjoyable, and I really look forward to your questions, and also to seeing you perhaps in the library at some point after the presentation. And so I'll leave my email address there, if you decide you want to ask something after the question period now. Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah. So can you put your last slide up again? I was going to photograph it, so.
Right.
Right, thank you. I'm going to have to go in a second, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you very much for a really fascinating talk and beautifully presented. Thank you. So just in terms of our discussion paper, we've got many colleagues online.
Yeah, we have 13 people online.
Okay, well, we can bring them into the discussion. Really, that's fascinating. Of course, there are lots of ways we can look at it, but I wonder whether you'd mind terribly giving you a little bit of comparative context. So if one was to give a similar presentation about the UL or about the Bodleian, would the story be greatly different? I suspect it would be a little bit different, but I don't know how much you've thought about that so far. Or, how would it go?
So for the UL or the Bodleian, they do have historic collections of Ottoman works, and they do have notable pieces in Ottoman. So, for example, I know specifically the Bodleian has, for example, a quite a long genealogy, a genealogical chart of the Ottoman dynasty, which we don't. We hold similar works, but not quite the same. They have much smaller collections than what we hold at the library. And that's partly because the buying power of the British Museum relied on the buying power of the state. And so there is a slightly more expensive collection at the British Library. And we were also able to purchase from sources outside of the country with a bit more ease because we were a government, we were connected in some way to the government. So we often had a link through to, for example, embassies or consulates if there was an interaction around a scholar in, for example, Turkey who wanted to bring materials in. But in a more substantive, in a deeper way, what's really different is the purpose, is less about what was purchased and more about what was donated. So the donors, we generally don't go out to seek donations of manuscripts. And usually it would be the donor themselves who made a decision to donate to the British Museum or British Library versus the UL or the Bodleian or Birmingham or John Rylands. And there what you tend to see is that someone who studied at that university, who perhaps taught at the university, tended to donate their collection. So the collections there have a much greater connection to a broader ecosystem within the same sort of organization. So you might have, for example, literary works that then reflect the courses that were taught about Ottoman history or literature in a specific period of time at Oxford or at Cambridge. You might have an individual who studied, for example, Arabic at Cambridge, who then was part of the Foreign Service, went out and maintained many contacts with Cambridge over the course of their life. And then upon retirement, when they came back and had Ottoman works, they gave them to the UL. Whereas the British Library's collection, what we tended to have is when people decided that they wanted something to be at the service of the nation or to have the widest remit so that anyone could really come in to make use of the collection, that's when they tended to come to the British Museum or the British Library and donate their collection. So there was tended to be a collection that was a bit broader, a bit more eclectic, or that didn't necessarily have a natural home. There wasn't as with Mundy's collection, there wasn't a place in the UK that would have someone studying Alevism or the cultures of Anatolia. And so it made sense for it to come to the British Library while still retaining a very close proximity to SOAS, which is where Mundy taught, and where presumably some of his students would remain for several years afterwards.
Isn't that fascinating? So presumably then, Nicholson and Arbery.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for that. So Nicholson and Arbery's collections are somewhere in their relevant institutional context now. I haven't looked at them, but they must have accumulated manuscripts in order to write their works. And then again, think about it comparatively. So on the continent, you mentioned the very early German work, but to my shame, I've forgotten what that very early work was. Was it early poetry? Was it sort of transcriptions of harpies and that kind of thing in the German 17th century Ottoman printing?
So the German printing was actually, if I remember correctly, it was a Christian text translated into Ottoman. And so it's a rare example because in general, the Ottomans blocked anyone coming in who wanted to convert Muslims to Christianity.
Absolutely.
So a fair amount of printing occurred in Rome, but then also in Germany, or rather in German lands in France, and to translate into the languages of Christian communities in the Ottoman Empire. But at some point in the 17th century, someone decided that they would produce something in Ottoman, and it was a bilingual text in German and in Latin and in Ottoman. And it's really not until the 19th century that you have something similar in terms of production, especially with the Bible Society, and production of works in both Arabic script, Ottoman, and English, the New Testament and the Old Testament.
Yes, because the first Ottoman Bible was about 1830 or something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Published in Paris or something like that. That's the first. So then so Hamner was as I'm referring to the German Ottoman scholar. He must have accumulated again a huge amount of material, but obviously more historical. Did you just leave it to, I don't even remember what university it was part of actually. I suppose he must have left it just to.
So Germany is a very interesting counterexample. Whereas in France, for example, the Bibliothèque Nationale has an Ottoman collection,
Yeah.
and in Austria you have at the Austrian National Library, which was formerly the Imperial Library, you have a collection that is in many ways one of the best collections in the country, and that was amassed both during the imperial period and then afterwards through connections with Russia. In Germany, you have a collection in Berlin that was amassed through the Prussians and then when Germany unites. And actually across Germany, it's the universities that are much stronger. So at Halle, you have at Leipzig collections. Goethe has very good collections. Münster has a small collection, I believe. You have throughout the country holdings that really reflect the scholars who worked in those universities and who brought their collections in, or who went back and forth between those cities and the Ottoman Empire. So it's much more university-based, where the universities essentially have these historic collections dating back to the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And then Berlin and the Staatsbibliothek has a small collection, but their interest has been much more in terms of creating a digital infrastructure to unite all of those now, so that you have you have a virtual national collection of non-Western European materials that draw on all of these different locations, where there are holdings of Ottoman, Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, Chinese materials.
That really is very nice to think about. And then on a slightly different tack, it's much later, of course, but as far as I know, the Quaritch archives are intact. Intact, of course, is a relative word, but I don't know whether you've had a chance to use the Quaritch archives to look at the sources of the manuscript material at all.
I haven't used the Quaritch ones yet for the Ottomans. For the Ottoman materials, it's been less useful, definitely for Arabic and for Persian. Quaritch is quite important. And one source that I've used quite a bit is actually Frederick Mann, who is the keeper of manuscripts up until the creation of the Oriental Manuscript Department at the museum. He kept very detailed diaries in which he would describe the sale. So he would describe going out to, for example, W.T. Boone, or going out to Roderick the Younger and Roderick the Senior to purchase these manuscripts from the 1820s until the 1860s. And sometimes those diaries are gold mines, because he reports what he's heard from the dealers about the manuscripts, and sometimes that changes over time. So you also get a sense there. It's not an Ottoman manuscript, but I spent some time with the diaries to look at Babur's Quran, a very well-known Quran that for a long time we only knew it came into the library in 1858, and the sort of legend was that a priest had acquired it. And Madden records how he's first told that it's a priest, and that's why it's all mysterious. He can't let anyone and Boone can't let anyone know why it came in and how it came in, because the priest will get in trouble. And gradually the story emerges that Boone tells him actually it's a photographer who has gone out to Egypt to photograph with two wealthy English travelers, and at one point buys these 7 manuscripts and removes them from Egypt. And so the diaries start to help piece apart as an archive, but in a way that hopefully going through more, whether the Quaritch archive, the Yehuda archive, that's now becoming more accessible, and the Hanji archive, which was just put online, to understand both in London and in Cairo, for example, where how those manuscripts were sourced, and then why they were moved to different different sellers.
Isn't that fascinating? I mean, so there is no Curzon writing in great detail how he lifted the stuff. Yeah.
And occasionally you get something like that, and I think Murray is probably the closest with his tales of sort of having someone come by with a stolen manuscript in Tehran. But for the most part, what we have access to is more the dealings between the dealer or the auction house and the curator or the keeper.
Yeah, it must have been no coincidence that Luzak was just opposite the BM. But the thing about music is I very much doubt whether they had any archives. It doesn't look like that sort of place. But maybe they're going to be archives.
Rather than archives, often what we end up relying on are auction catalogs, book catalogs, because they tend to have it last much longer.
Yes. Yes. But I must off the conversation. Excuse me. So, maybe you'd like to ask a question if I speak. How does this compare to your archives?
Oh, I think it's much older. Yeah, I'm a bit overwhelmed with that. I need to have a look at the new catalog website now with this back today. Yeah, thank you very much.
Anybody online? Do you want to get them up, Craig? You have to escape from this one.
Yeah. Anybody online, if they want to unmute yourselves and you can fire away with a
You
question.
could stop the sharing. Stop
No, that's
we'll be able to see them, won't we?
yeah. That won't work there, unfortunately.
Oh, is it not?
Unless you stop the actual PowerPoint completely.
Okay, I can shut down the PowerPoint.
Yeah, completely stop it and that'll do it.
And then
bring up
you
Zoom.
might be able to see our colleagues online. So maybe you have a question.
The gallery there.
And will that eventually come up on the screen? Otherwise, you might have to take the questions
Okay, so I might.
Yeah, is there anybody online, if you can hear me, then please do not hesitate to ask a question.
So I see Colin has asked, impressive many thanks. Please update us on where you are in the recovery from the cyber attack.
A very good question, but you may not be able to answer it. Only answer what you can.
So yes, I'm not sure if everyone's aware of the cyber attack. And essentially in October of 2023, we suffered a cyber attack and it brought down our systems. And so we've gradually been rebuilding. We now have an online catalog of our printed materials, and we have the interim online catalog of our manuscripts and archives. And so the former is not interim because we can actually add new books. And so if you're looking for printed materials, we can add information about those and make them accessible. If you're looking for manuscripts and archives, we currently don't have the capacity to add materials. We hopefully will have that very shortly. But we're starting to now look to tender and acquire a new system to be able to catalog online all of our archives and manuscripts. A portion of what we have in terms of our digitized manuscripts have gone back online. So those materials have been republished. And one of the problems with the library's infrastructure is that because we had quite a large and old infrastructure, things were kept in different places. So we didn't have just one store of all of the images on that we had produced. And as a result, only some of the images are now accessible to post online, whereas other images require much more work in order to connect them to the descriptions and then pass them through to publish them online. So we're trying to get as many of those manuscripts back online, but it's proving quite challenging. I would expect it will take several years for the full digitized catalog to go back online, digitized collection of manuscripts. But we're trying very hard to get things that we know are of great interest to scholars. So manuscripts that people routinely request, manuscripts where there are continuous requests for images or where someone needs to study them from abroad, and to try to get those either on the catalog or to get them on a site that's called Images Online. And so I would encourage you to check back both Images Online and check back with the catalog from time to time, as you might be surprised that something suddenly goes back on. But it is a very long-term process, and we're just gradually trying to restore to 100% all of those sort of legally required services like legal deposit before we can then fully restore aspects like digitized manuscripts.
It must have been a terrible shock.
It was. It was. I remember trying to log in because of the way that cybersecurity works, we were told that it almost always happens on a Saturday. And I remember trying to log in on a Saturday morning and thinking, I'm sure I know my password, and trying 6 or 7 times until I thought, oh, there's a problem, they're updating the system or something like that. And then gradually news started to filter in. And we essentially, our managers began to text us because text was the only way to reliably get a message out to everyone. And it was very scary to think of how damaging maybe 3 hours worth of coding could be to an institution, to a national institution.
The ESTC was out for 2 years or something, incredible. 3 years with ESTC. I mean, the ESTC could be down for 3 years. It's mind-boggling.
The only silver lining is that the data was safe, and we knew that the data was safe, and then it really, exactly, the ESTC, there had been talk for such a long time about having to move it, and now there was this great impetus to move it to a secure site to make sure that it was functional and would stand the test of time, in a way that we now understand. Even the online catalog, when it was created, the idea was, oh, well, no one's really going to use an online system to find manuscripts. And now we know everything you do online is going to be the long-term solution. You have to build it in a way that you can maintain it long-term. And it's really changed our perception.
Yeah. But, that's something we always discuss here that I should be very interested to hear your opinion about. It's integrating, and this is something that's relevant to your work as well, it's integrating the printed material with the digital material. Because increasingly when we acquire stuff, we still get physical paper, but we acquire an enormous amount of material which is digital, either born digital or reproductions, of course. And it's very, very, very difficult to integrate the two forms of media together in such a way that's sustainable. And in the museum's case, in the library's case, do you get a lot of, how does it work with digital material? Do you get a lot of people leaving you digital images, or is it always done these days through syndication between institutions? Anyway, anything you'd like to say about that would be very interesting.
So since we're the legal deposit, but since 2014, there has been a change in the legislation to allow publishers to decide whether they want to deposit something physically or digitally, and it's entirely up to the publisher. And then we have to create a system where we can provide access that meets the legislation to those digital works. It creates two different issues. One is that we then obviously have to be able to maintain the actual items. And so physical books, as I said, everything sort of decays over time. And so we know how to deal with that. We know how to the glue is going to dissipate, or the pages will become brittle. So we know how to control for that. The digital works, you really have to think about how you preserve them, because a book, unless everyone forgets how to read Latin script, the book is a technology that is pretty easy to use, in 300 years. But if you think about a PDF, you have no guarantee that in 5 years Adobe will exist, that the PDF will be usable, or that the PDF will be recognized by whatever system you use. And so digital preservation is a much faster moving topic, and it's one that's increasing in its importance because the physical works are just so hard to preserve. And not to mention then, of course, the fact that you have them on servers, and how do you keep those servers safe? Because a day like today, a server can blow very easily, and so you don't want that data to be lost. But then on the user side, it's also finding a way. We have a catalog where we try to show whether the item is physical or digital, give the access that is appropriate to that item, depending on how someone would like to use it. And one of the really challenging aspects of this is copyright. because obviously a physical book, you can see when someone is trying to photocopy it or to take photos of it, whereas you don't know if someone is using a digital copy outside of the legal bounds of where that copy should be used. So we do have a catalog that allows us to catalog both the same way and provide information about what we have, but it's a much harder system for us to be able to ensure proper access depending on whether something is digital or physical. And that's one of the reasons why we only accept digital materials when they're produced in the UK, because trying to manage the copyright of a digital work produced in Turkey is really, really challenging, because we don't fully understand, who can see it when and how often they can see it and whether they can take photos of it. Whereas we have a team of lawyers on staff who can then advise us, you can provide access to this, and as long as it's done on the premises of the library, the copyright law is respected.
Because as you rightly imply, there's an explosion of reproductions of manuscript material in Turkey, for the last 20 or 30 years, maybe even a bit longer. First of all, in cheap reproduced book, and no doubt now in digital form. But you can buy the book from Turkey of the manuscript, can't you? It's a printed book. And then it just comes into the library as normal.
Yeah, so we tend to buy the physical books if possible from outside of the UK and North America, because we have agreements with publishers often in North America. But sometimes what the halfway point that works for us is being able to simply connect people. So if a resource, many of the manuscripts are available. So if it's Yazma Eserler, then they will often publish free of charge the digitized copy of the manuscript or the transcription of the manuscript. And then what our preference is to have a catalog entry that describes that. But then really what you're doing is just going to the website of the Yazma Eserler. So essentially you let them manage the preservation, you let them manage access, and we just redirect people to it. But yes, Turkey, so one of probably the most active publishing cultures, definitely in the region, but around the world, and it's challenging to keep up with it.
Well, anybody else online that you'd like to ask a question? Or is there anybody there, Craig?
They're all silent.
They're all silent. Well, perhaps the heat. Can anybody well, in that case, I think we just have to thank you for a remarkably enlightening talk on one which will long remain on our minds. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I hope to see everyone in the library as well. We're very happy to have visitors and people to come and use the collection. So don't be shy.
Thank you.
Very